Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Explore Explain. And in this wonderful episode 4, I'm delighted to welcome Dominicus Bauer and Alice Toot to the conversation to look at one of their stunning works, one of my favourite projects of this year. It probably will remain the favourite project of this year, even though we're still only in May. So we'll see how that goes. Lovely to see you both again. For the benefit of the listeners and the viewers, maybe I can just invite you to introduce yourselves briefly. Dominicus, to kick off with.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Thanks for having us. I'm Dominicus Bauer. I've been working in data visualization for the last 15 years or so. So I did my PhD in personal data visualization and then switched over to freelance roles and worked for big clients like the OECD or the Google and the World Bank most recently. And yeah, and I sometimes do projects together with Alice here.
Yeah, so I started out also with a PhD in data visualization, also personal data visualization, unrelated. But then I did a brief intermezzo in industry, working more on UX, UI design. And then I decided to go back a little bit more into data visualization again, because that's where my passion is kind of more. And so I became a freelancer about 3 years ago. And since then, often worked with Dominicus, also Moritz, Stefano and others. And it's been really great. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there the Atlas. So I was tempted to try and do an episode of this about the Atlas. It was the Atlas of World Sustainable Development Goals, something along the lines.
Yes,
And
exactly.
I was overwhelmed because I thought this would actually be a 10-part episode. It was such a huge project, but we'll share a link to it in the post for this episode. It was a stunning piece of work, and I adore every aspect of it. Not quite as much as this project today, but still very, very good. This project today is a project titled Full of Themselves, an analysis of title drops in movies. And this was published earlier this year, I think around March time from memory. So we're going to get really into the depths of this today. But to begin with, can I just invite you to perhaps just outline roughly the premise of this project, what form it takes, what it's about. What is a title drop?
Yeah, that's the big question that I started with. So a title drop is in movie lingo if a character in the movie says the title of the movie. And I had a lot of ideas of which movies would do that and for how often and why and things like that. And of course, since I'm a data visualization and data person in general, I figured let's let the data speak about this, and maybe we can find something interesting. So I had this little passion project brewing in the back of my head for, I don't know, a decade or so. And basically every time I saw a movie doing a title drop, I thought, oh yeah, you really should do this project at some point. And now this March, in between February and March, in between client projects, I figured now's the time for this little 1 weekend max project.
And I suspect that is because it took a much longer time than you expected. But it's been a so as I mentioned when you first launched it, it was an inquiry that I've always had in my back of my mind as well. And I love the idea of you kind of sitting on this potential passion project for all these years, and then suddenly you pounce on it. And I'm delighted you did, because you did far better a job than I could have done on this inquiry.
Thank you.
I mean, would you describe yourselves as movie geeks? Are you kind of movie fans in general, or is it just, obviously we're all exposed to movies, so I guess we've always got that curiosity.
Yeah, I'm very much into movies. I think more than Alice.
Dominicus is the movie geek of
the movie
the two
geek,
of us.
yeah. I watch a lot of movies, and I've spent way more time watching movies and reading about them and thinking about them back when I was younger, but even now I'm still fascinated by them as part of pop culture. So yeah, I just felt like this was the perfect project to do.
Now, can I answer it? This is almost like a question to answer or ask at the end, but are you now able to watch a movie without in the back of your mind thinking, do I check beforehand or do I wait for it to happen? Are you able to just relax into movies now? Has it ruined it forever?
I think I'm done with title drops now forever, so I don't care about them anymore.
I noticed them now because before this project, I didn't know that was a thing. So this was totally like came from Dominicus.
So maybe I ruined Alice now.
Before that, I was not really into the whole, or I didn't know really about the phenomenon, but now I really notice them a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned there, Dominicus, that this was a passion project and in between kind of client projects. So it obviously brings a whole different dynamic to the pressures, to the opportunities, to the responsibilities on your shoulders rather than the kind of feedback that comes from others. So you had this kind of dormant spark in your mind, and at this point you pounced. Were there any other things at the time that you were thinking of doing around movies, or was it so concentrated on this inquiry? Were you tempted to just broaden the scope a little bit, or was it always, this is it, this is the thing?
So the way I framed it before, I always thought of it just as this tiny little analysis thing, like all of those tiny little analyses that we know of, right? So I figured, okay, I'll focus on this because I know how feature creep can blow up little ideas. So I thought, okay, I'm going straight for this one. And even this one, of course, was a massive thing because once you start looking into the details of any topic, I think, things blow themselves out of proportion.
Yeah, it was really like, it took a while, and Dominicus was kind of always playing with the data and talking to me about all the things that he found, and it took like a week, and then it took 2 weeks, and I'm like, wow, you're still like on the data. What's the findings? And then it's always like got further and further away, and so even this tiny idea kind of turned into a much bigger idea than we thought. So it was more the opposite way. Instead of broadening the scope, we had a trouble of kind of narrowing it to some point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and just as a side note, while we're talking about passion projects, I always think it's interesting to get people's views on the role of passion projects, because I will do one for different reasons. It might be to practice, it might be to make mistakes that don't have consequences, to try things out, but sometimes it's also just a release to get away from the slightly pressure cooker environment of a client project where you've got deliverables and deadlines and budgets. What's your, I'll come to you both on this, what's your take on the importance and the value of passion projects maybe for people getting into the field and maybe into a broader creative field in general?
You want to go?
Yeah, I always do them mostly for curiosity reasons. So rather than trying to practice, although that comes with it naturally, it's usually a question that I'm really interested in. And I think in this case, it was like Dominicus who was really interested in this question. But when I do projects, usually it's something that I really want to explore. And then basically all of the other nice side effects are, of course, valuable as well.
Yeah.
So learning how, trying new things, like really sometimes weird things, and not all of my passion projects make it to the general public audiences. I usually like to experiment a lot on my own, and usually don't have the final push to really make it polished enough to put it out there.
Right.
And I think in this case, I helped with that part with Dominicus's passion project. That was kind of my role here.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, passion projects are also nice to, as you said, not only take a break from the pressure cooker environment of client work, but also to play the client yourself for once,
Right.
and actually use your skills that you've honed of data analysis and data visualization to do something that you really want to see in the world, which is also cool.
It kind of felt a little bit like you were my client for this because it was much more Dominicus's project, and I was like trying to do something that he would be happy with in order to put this out. So it wasn't like, for me, it was almost like a client project, but of course we were much like it was.
Of course, I didn't pay her. So.
Those
It's
are
all
the
for
funnest,
exposure.
the funnest
Unpaid
ones.
invoices.
No, but
yeah,
it was. It's fun to work on something together and to just play around.
Absolutely, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned there about the unpublished passion projects. I feel like there should be a website for like an amnesty. Here's all the unpublished or unpublishable passion projects. They should put them out there and judge people and make sense of it all. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's and I think you're right there about the idea that the question or the curiosity then acts as the spine, as the whole thing that everything hangs off, and it gives you that focus. And it's not unique to passion projects, but it certainly helps if you've got that sense of focus. Now, you mentioned there about kind of working together on this, and you've already perhaps established that, in a sense, Dominicus, you were kind of leading on this, and Alice, you were certainly supporting on the design side. And we'll touch on those different pathways as we go down the process. How do you find working together? Do you find that you bring the best out of each other? Do you find that you kind of, not to use a cliche, but you complete each other? How do you find that working together?
Yeah, I've always find it really enriching, especially because we do come from a little bit of a different side of the whole data viz spectrum. So I'm much more on the design side, and Dominicus comes more from the really like coding side. So we both do both. So he does also design and I also code, but for the really kind of like experimental coding stuff, it's really nice to have Dominicus on board, so he can just more quickly do more experimental things with code. And I think design wise, it's probably a little bit the other way around. Yeah. But yeah, it's always, we do share an office, we are really close, so it's very easy to interact and to really bounce ideas off of each other really quick. So yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I also feel, so the Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals was the first project we did together. And I think over the years we've actually gotten better at working together, because that is a separate skill.
Yeah.
But now it really works really well.
I think when you're so close, like we are, then sometimes working together can be sometimes a little bit of a challenge, because you do not have the same, like you don't have the same like professionalism maybe with your so that we had to really learn. But I think
it's a lot of honesty.
Yeah, there's a lot of honesty. But in this, especially in passion projects like this, I think it's a little more fun, because you can really, it's not this pressure and you have to anticipate all these other people's needs and opinions. So but even with client projects, I think we always now kind of draw each other into each other's projects now, because it now works, and we are so like experienced with it now after the Atlas and other projects that it's really...
Plus one other thing, when it comes to passion projects, it's always dangerous, I find, if you do them completely by yourself, because then you don't have this feedback loop where you actually show it to someone who might not be or come from the same background as you are, might not be as crazy about the data as you are. So it's always good to have this back and forth between one slightly less
movie geek
person.
Yeah, for me, I was always like, actually in this project, I was always playing the role of the less geeky movie interested in movies, but not like super geeky. And so it helped to sometimes say, okay, I really don't get this reference, like this is probably only clear to people who are really into the whole meme world around this topic. And so I was sometimes...
The first version of the page was way more obtuse,
like,
I think.
Wait,
so.
what is all this? But I think it's still in there, because it's also... definitely speaks to people who are already interested in the topic. So
that's it.
we didn't, yeah.
And I think what you've reflected there also touches on my next, not so much question, because the next thing I was going to discuss was audience, and it is a slightly less clear-cut thing for a passion project who the audience is, because it's for you, really, and people like you, and people by extension who could be like you. So to have that immediate person nearby who can kind of wear both hats, something that's on the side of the development, but also kind of say that doesn't make sense, or what the hell's that meme about? That it does act as that sort of sense check. Now you've already mentioned timescales in terms of intention. Short weekend of work, get it done, have a nice evening on the second day. I mean, did you? I don't know really where I'm perhaps going with this, but did you at times have to impose some, made up deadlines and say, look, we've got to get it done by then? Not because we don't have time, but if I take too long on this, then it's just not the right way to spend time. So how did you manage your own time, given that there is this sort of vacuum of any pressure from external perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, there's always some kind of pressure as a freelancer, because of course you need to make money from time to time to actually live off of it. Nice. So yeah. Really just working on your passion projects is cool, but doesn't pay the bills. So there were deadlines looming, but actually what got me to finish this project was first encouragement, let's call it encouragement, from Alice. But also at some point I realized, okay, the Oscars are coming up on March the 8th, I think, and that seemed like a good time to release a project about movies. Yeah. So I said, okay, I'm gonna do it the week before, Monday before, I think it was, and by then it needs to be out there.
Yeah.
And I think at that point I had worked for maybe 6 weeks on it. So that was way too long for this simple weekend project.
It's a long weekend, yeah. And it was also kind of getting bigger and bigger in terms of the data and like all of the analysis. And I thought at a certain point, everything once you're in it is really fascinating, and it was fascinating to me as well once I got interested in the topic. So it's really a little bit difficult sometimes to stop yourself and put on the hat of someone who comes at this from without all of these 6 weeks of spending time with this kind of data, and really think, okay, are people really going to care like about this niche detail, about this sub thing of this other thing? So I also wanted to encourage us to maybe focus on stuff that will be of hopefully still somewhat general interest. And that I think also helped to have this made up deadline. So we just get there and throw out some stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it's something that I've picked up on quite a few episode conversations like this, the notion in journalism of the news peg, which was something completely new to me, whereby you've got something in the news or some event happening around the world where it makes sense to try and align with the release or the timing of that. So yeah, that does make a lot of sense in terms of the Oscars. Now, the work that we see is a digital piece. I don't necessarily see it as a scrolly telling piece in the classic sense, but it is a vertical sort of digital journey. Were you ever tempted to, and it has its own URL, titledrops.net. Were you ever tempted to seek to publish it anywhere else, like on a movie website, on a pop culture viz site like The Pudding, for example? Or was it always going to be something, no, keep this kind of in-house?
Yeah, so I've actually been thinking about it. Once I had set myself this deadline, which I think was the week before release, actually, I realized that there probably won't be enough time to get in contact with The Pudding, for example, and set everything up to be launched at that point in time. So I figured, let's do it ourselves. But of course, I think we're both huge fans of The Pudding, and that was an obvious inspiration for that, or like for the format of this piece.
Yeah.
So Yeah, it would have been nice, but I think we got a retweet at least, so that's I think that's a sign of approval of what we did there.
That's the endorsement you need. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you know, there's different ways of looking at it. Sometimes you put work out on other platforms and it's seen as their work, and you end up as a footnote. You know, so there's pros and cons on both sides. Now, just looking again at the sort of initial starting point of the kind of creative journey, and this perhaps is something that you've already alluded to, but it's obviously the whole premise is almost a write-up of your analysis, of your discovery through this fascination of title drops. And then later on, down the bottom of the project, but you can jump to it straight away, is more of an exploratory tool where you can find your own movie and almost build up a portfolio of movies of interest and share those. When you set out, were you always going to set out to do essentially a write-up, or did that just happen because you got so into the data that you had to share this stuff, and actually your original idea was to do more of a lookup device, but you just got too transfixed by the content?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think I always wanted to do kind of a write-up, a more concise and shorter one, definitely,
Right.
with clearer findings. So it turned out, I mean, it's a very, very complex and very qualitative topic. So it's really hard to come up with all of those snappy findings. But so originally, I definitely planned on having something like this fun, nice to read explainer thing about the analysis itself. But then this movie explorer tool that I've also built became bigger and bigger and more important. And I mean, it started out as just a debug tool because I had the original data and I needed to check if it actually made sense. So something like that seemed the obvious way to go. Then it turned into its own little thing. And I mean, with projects like this, it's always nice to provide people with some benefit. Like they can create a list of their favorite movies and then see all of the title drops at once and share it with their friends and all of that. So that seemed like the obvious thing to do.
It was also, I think, like just we noticed working with this debugger kind of thing that it was just fun to put in because always when you do this and you read something, like even at part of the analysis, movie titles pop into your head and you're like, I wonder about X. And then you really directly want to check it. And if that's not part of the page, then without the Explorer, you don't have a way of doing it, although all of the data would be there. And so I thought, this is really fun. Let's make that definitely part of the thing that you can do. Yeah.
Absolutely, and you know, one of the key things is that you signpost the availability of the Movie Explorer, you know, essentially above the fold in kind of old-fashioned speak, and it's almost saying, look, if you want to dive in, go ahead. And I guess that's also recognizing that some visitors will come back. You know, maybe the first visit is to read through, and then you come back and get, right, I want to go, and I've just thought of a movie. Right, let's see how this plays out.
That's exactly the point why we put that there. It's not just about like jumping over the analysis. It's more for revisiting visitors kind of to be able to not have to scroll through the entire analysis again, but directly check your next hypothesis or do something yourself.
That's right, yeah. Now, from again at the start of this process, and you can kind of clarify at what point, perhaps Alice, you came into the, you know, the sort of styling, the design ideas point. You know, what would we see if we saw a mood board of your ideas, the kind of look and feel, the colour? Because one of the things that I adore about this is not just the little celluloid movie strips, but the whole colour palette and the accentuation of the yellow. And we'll get into the colour thinking a bit later on, but what do we see if we see this kind of initial sketches, ideas? What was going through your mind initially, at least?
Yeah, initially I definitely had this picture in my head that the site had to be dark because movie theaters are dark, and Dominicus had all of these little snippets of movies, and also the GIFs and in the page, and I wanted it to look kind of like they were on the silver screen, so to speak. And so for me, definitely the page had to be dark to make them look like on a movie screen. And then yes, the yellow I think was kind of just popped really nicely and was kind of hinting at this light in that you need to project a movie, so it kind of pops out really a lot from this dark background. And it, of course, I went with this kind of more browner tint because it really came from the movie strip. So I know from the old film strip rolls from my old cameras, this kind of color scheme of the film strip that just made the made this color theme come to life somehow.
It feels like the single word that comes to mind is kind of Kodak, that kind of old school Polaroid kind of Kodak view. So, no, it's really nice. And the other thing that we often do at the start of a process is possibly, not all the time, but we possibly look around to see what's been done before about something similar, about movies in general, but perhaps about the quirks of title drops. And you did pick out in the commentary in the project about the existence of one smaller scale sort of title drop experiment, and then, as you say, so many listicles, or BuzzFeed type compilations of the top 10 most cringeworthy moments. So again, from the point of view of kind of early thinking, how far and wide did you look elsewhere for inspiration, but also at that point were there things that you wanted to avoid emulating, or even cliches, visual cliches to avoid thinking about including?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, of course, since I mainly wanted to see this thing out in the world, I did some searching initially if someone else had actually done that. And as you mentioned, there's been this analysis by a different website called Datanaut, I think, and it goes into a very similar direction to what we did, but it's only I think all of the movies that have won an Oscar over time. Right. But it's a similar analysis also from the approach and so on. And so that was definitely an inspiration. Unfortunately, it's really only those Oscar movies, and you can't really tell a lot about the rest of all movies that exist. But then, there's all of these listicles, and they're all very listically, so they're all very very much hype and this is so awful and all of that stuff. So I wanted to stay clearer, more on the data side, and also usually those listicles are very qualitative, so it's just the journalist's opinion, what they think, what the top 10 most cringeworthy title drops are. And again, that's a restriction that you have if you work with quantitative data, that you can't really tell how cringeworthy a certain title drop is. So that's not part of the analysis. I mean, maybe I should have asked ChatGPT or so. Maybe it would have known something about that. But yeah.
But I think some things that we also maybe wanted to avoid, or that we wanted to maybe put on top of what has already been done, was to show a lot of data, so really base it on like a large data set, but then not lose some of the more more feely things of the movie. So because I think the Datanaut piece, what it did well was like really also do a data analysis and not just like pick out your favorite cringeworthy whatever's, but we still wanted to show a little bit of context around the title drops. So especially when it's a short title drop, you usually get the whole sentence around that title. So I thought it was really kind of nice to see what contexts the titles are dropped in. So it kind of gives you a little bit more from the movies. So I think that
sort of widen the lens a little bit.
Ideally, we would have had like snippets of all of the title drops, like movie snippets, but it's just not possible to have like this much film clips in there. That would have been like my favorite thing if we would have like had, but at least in the beginning, one of very iconic one from Back to the Future is shown right away, so you can see like this is what a title drop actually also looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also feels like, a Back to the Future age group will also be the people who are going to go and visit this, myself included. Now, on to the data. So we've already kind of just touched upon there that the other previous analysis was quite limited in its scope. Yours was not. Yours was vast. And obviously we could spend 17 hours about this topic alone, but I guess just in a nutshell, can you speak to the sort of process that you went through to, first of all, kind of identify where to find such data? And you mentioned two references, OpenSubtitles.com and IMDb, which I guess most people know the latter at least. And just to kind of just elaborate a bit further, I think you identified 89,242 movies in English from Open Subtitles, and there were 121,797 movies on IMDb. So you obviously mesh these together. But just going back to the start, kind of how did you identify that this would be the source to rely upon?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had this idea of working with subtitles for this project relatively early, since of course you could look at movie scripts, for example, but they're not as readily available. Plus, another benefit that subtitles bring is that they actually have a timestamp with them, which movie scripts don't. Plus, actors might also start ad-libbing or something, and then that pops up in the subtitles, but not in the script. So, and then I started looking around on the internet, and there's lots of fan-made subtitle databases out there. And I think one of the biggest ones is OpenSubtitles.com. And they have a huge selection of them. Of course, the only question is, how do you get this data? As is usually the case. They shut down their API a couple of years ago, and so I figured, okay, maybe scraping, but even then they were pretty adamant about, please don't scrape our page, we will cut you off and all of that. So I decided in my desperation to just send them an email and telling them about this project of mine, and maybe they could. And 3 hours later, I got an email back. Yeah, sure, that sounds amazing. What data do you need? And
Fantastic.
so they actually did a database dump themselves based on my specifications, more or less, and then sent me a 10 gigabyte file of all of the subtitles that I needed.
Wow.
So shout out to OpenSubtitles.com.
Absolutely.
.org, right?
.com.
Oh, sorry.
I think it's the same, actually.
Yeah, okay, maybe it's the same.
Anyway.
Go to them all
so
and praise them all. Yes. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
That was great.
So I had my subtitles then, and then of course the question was, where do I get metadata from? Because one of the, or a couple of things that I had in my head when it came to this analysis was there's a clear pattern over the decades, or maybe something genre related, that the really cheap horror movies would do more title drops than the high class dramas. And that's where IMDb came in. So the Internet Movie Database, I think that's been around since forever, since the internet started, basically.
Yeah.
And they fortunately did provide a data set of those 120,000 movies, and you can just download it from their page. So that's cool. Plus I had another one that contained the actors that were associated with a certain movie. And that let me, for example, extract movie titles that had a character's name in them, stuff like that. But that might go too far now into the data analysis.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, that's interesting. And I guess with all these things, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, whereby you seek out data because you know roughly what you want. You've got a bit of a wish list in mind, and then you get it, and there's perhaps more than you expected, and then that opens up new possibilities. So there's a bit of a dance that takes place there. But it feels that you were you were fairly confident that this was the best kind of quality, most comprehensive data you could get. But obviously, there's a degree of work in thereafter to refine and finesse and to merge and to transform to what I believe led to 73,921 movies in the end, covering the last 80 years, which you say is about 61% of the movies. So what was eliminated, and I guess why?
Yeah, so one thing that I realized once I looked at those 10 gigs of subtitles is that, of course, everything is fan and user created, which means that it might not be perfect, but then what is? So they only sent me for each movie the highest rated subtitle that they had available. So that already helped a lot. But even then you have just really things you wouldn't think about beforehand. For example, you would realize, okay, IMDb is talking about the cinematic release of a movie, but I have the subtitle for the special edition, which is 20 minutes longer, so it no longer matches up.
Right.
Or it's just, it erroneously is classified as English, but it's a different language. Or the biggest problem actually for counting those title drops was that some subtitles would mention a character's name in the subtitles when they speak. And that, of course, would blow up the numbers enormously if the character's name is also the title of the movie. All of those fun little details. And that's also why Alice had to stop me at some point from actually writing up all of that, because that would be more of a PhD
Not only
thesis,
writing it up, but I think also at a certain point, there was the data cleaning did creep. Always continue to happen, because we did have some findings again in the analysis, and then we were like, why is this? And sometimes it was because of yet another little mistake in the data cleaning. And at a certain point I was like, okay, there will always be errors in this whole, like in the end, let's go with this now and not keep adding or changing the data set again, because it is not possible to identify every single thing. Sometimes it was stuff like a dash that is a dot in the IMDb, and so and sometimes it was just so many little things that Dominicus kept cleaning and cleaning and cleaning, and I think it was great. So now it's pretty much there, but still some responses on social media were still about little things that people discovered. So I think it's
Those
just
people.
never going. It's never going to happen that this is like exactly perfect.
It's cool that people notice that, but then something like, oh, this one movie it has the wrong number of title drops, it's 2 instead of 3, your whole project is worthless. That's
that
not
didn't really happen.
helping.
It was just like, I was kind of saying, okay, we will just maybe stop now because it's good enough. So yeah, we don't end up finding more.
That's so important. Good enough has to be a place where you find like inner peace, I think. Especially when you start to get so swamped by new rules, new ways to trap errors that only increase it by 0.001% quality. And I think
and then you have to explain that too, right? Like
Yes.
then you have to talk about it, because then you have made yet another rule that you now asked, like, how did you exclude? So now we can't even like really specify all of the. I think it's written up in there, but I think it's still like gets more and more complicated to talk about this question, which I do think is important to be able to talk about. So maybe even if there is this leads to a little bit like uncleanness in the data, sometimes it's better to have your criteria really straight than to end up with the perfect data set.
Plus, I think that's also the beauty of having such a big data set here, that it's roughly correct. So if it's off by 0.1% here and there, it doesn't really matter. It's still the same conclusions.
I think the bigger decisions were stuff like deciding if the movie title is a letter, and that letter is
Right.
like part of a word, for example, not to count it, but if it's just a single letter, to count it, like stuff like that you can formulate as rules. They were always kind of coming as we went, because you can't think of all of these rules in advance. You can't have them all in your head, like it or e.
So actually the first result from this project was where I proudly declared to the people from OpenSubtitles.com that the movie with the most title drops is called E.
But then we had
just
to
the letter
clean,
E.
right?
But,
Like the
yeah.
letter E as single word instead of the letter E as part of words. But then there's also it, where it's like it is sometimes part of sentences where it's not really referring to the thing that is the title, and we couldn't identify that. So this is where kind of you had to stop.
But I didn't go there. So
Yeah, we
it's
didn't.
still there. I don't know what it is, what Stephen King meant with it. So it is fine. It counts.
And you know, and you can't give that treatment, that kind of almost bespoke treatment to 73,000 movies. You have to just draw a line. And you mentioned the letters E and it there. And I think the other major rules that you established were around sequels with numerals and also titles with colons, so kind of compound titles, which, again, it just feels like a very sort of logical way to say these are the major things that we're going to make some assumptions around and handle for. And thereafter, yes, there might be some things that are just out, but please don't social media us to tell us, please. Otherwise, we'll take away your license for the Movie Explorer. Now, in the exploration of the data, and we'll come on to some of the content in the page shortly, but just some of the headlines. And I guess my question here will be, I don't know, just when you discovered these facts and figures, did they surprise you? Were you shocked or not shocked? So, for example, 36.5%, so about a third of movies have at least one title drop in their runtime. Did that surprise you? I'm still trying to work out if that's more than I expected or fewer. I think probably more than I expected, actually, thinking about it.
Yeah, it was definitely more than I expected.
Yeah.
So I would have assumed maybe 10%.
Yeah.
But then I realized that I hadn't really thought hard enough about this topic, because if you look at movie titles, a lot of them are just the protagonist's name. And of course you have a title drop then. And then you go back to the question, do you want to count this as a title drop? Because it's a character. And anyway, so in this project, we're counting it as a title drop. But yeah, like a third of movies, I found it surprising that it's really that many. Plus, if you then also look at the actual number of title drops that a movie does, if it does a title drop, I think it's 10 point something. So really, they're mentioning the title on average 10 times each movie. I found that really surprising. It's a lot.
What I also found surprising, because you just said, all of this high number comes from all of the movies that have the protagonist as a title. But then we looked into that, and really like eliminating the movies that had the protagonist as the title. Didn't really put the number down substantially, so it goes down by 2 percentage points. So that to me was the more surprising thing, because I was like, oh yeah, this huge number comes from all of the protagonist movie titles, and then it turns out no, it really doesn't. Maybe it's a thing that is mentioned over and over that is also giving the title. Maybe it's not a person, or maybe the person has two. I don't know. It was surprising to me that if you eliminate all of the movies with the protagonist as a title, that it doesn't bring the number down.
Even if
so
you
much.
remove Barbie and Oppenheimer from the analysis, it's still 34%.
Well, that's it. And you know, there's such a central force in all movie thinking right now. But you're absolutely right. It's, when I was looking at your analysis as well, the idea that, and I can't remember the term you used, almost like the pure title drops. And they were still very, very, very frequent. As you mentioned there, Barbie, 267 title drops. And I like the way that you invented a completely new unit of measurement, the Barbies per minute. And then there's the Mickeys per minute for the Mickey Mouse. So yeah, there's a nice aspect there. Were you ever... I'm just thinking sort of live now. Were you ever tempted to think about a ratio of mentions per script length rather than minutes? I'm just thinking, having watched Mad Max, there's so few words mentioned, but the density of the title drop mention might be kind of greater than in a much more scripted movie.
We haven't looked into that, but that's an interesting ratio. Yeah. So we looked at the length of the title itself, and in
also
correlation
the length of
with
the movie, right?
and the length of the movie,
but not the length of the script.
Yeah, but that's a good point. If people don't say a lot, it makes a title drop much more meaningful.
More potent in a way. Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah.
And I still can't believe they don't say Jaws in Jaws. That's the one that I went straight away to that. Now, just before we move on to the content and the design, any other sort of small details that you experienced, or struggles, or things you want to kind of get off your chest in a very, almost like a psychiatrist chair, about what you found or didn't find? And actually, what you didn't find, I think, is important, because sometimes that's helpful. It's frustrating at the point, but it can be helpful. And there are some bits later on that you didn't find anything. I think it was the IMDb rating from memory.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't a. Did you come across any other analysis that you thought this will definitely reveal something? No.
Yeah, I had some experiences like that. So I realized that I was very much off with all of the ideas I had about title drops. So all of the previous conceptions that I had about this were pretty much wrong, except for a correlation between the decade a movie was released in and the number of title drops. So it's actually it's gotten worse over the last decades. So there's more and more title drops in movies in the 2010s and the 2020s than in the 1960s, for example, where the number was the lowest. But then there was no correlation between rating and number of title drops. Again, my 10% title drops of over all movies. No, it's 35. So yeah, maybe that's what I realized, that I should be way more humble about my ideas about data before actually looking into it.
It's funny because to me, like when Dominicus talked about title drops, and he was telling me, it's this point in the movie when a character really like looks in the camera and really ironically says the title. I was realizing over the course of this project that that's actually not most of the instances of title drops. And I think that's why the assumptions were wrong, because he was more thinking of that type of title drop, when I think oftentimes, or it's just an hypothesis that I kind of came up with during this, because I thought maybe sometimes it's not that the title is intentionally dropped in the movie, but instead it's an important line of the movie script that becomes the title. So it's more, some really important phrase, something that is really meaningful as part of the piece, is used as a title. So in that instance, it wouldn't be this ironic, kind of type of title drop. It would in fact be really like, sensible to have the title appear.
Yeah.
Yes. So that I thought was interesting to come at it from the opposite direction. And we actually, I think, ended up looking up if there's research about, and of course there is, but it went very far into the humanities side of film analysis studies. It's like, how do titles come about and what type of titles are there? So it really opened my eyes.
Titles, of course, are always a marketing instrument as well.
Yeah.
So you want to have a catchy title, and there's actually rules and lists of rules of how to make a good movie title. And they're also doing test audiences, of course, and asking them, would you go to this film or to this film? And then you name it accordingly. So it's not all creative freedom by the writers or directors. That's, of course, a big business.
Yeah. But I think, just sort of summarising that, I think it's an important point that you've both mentioned, both that you might arrive at something with preconceived ideas and expectations. The key thing is to be welcoming of those being challenged and refreshed and updated. But also sometimes it can be helpful to have that two sort of pronged attack. One side which is completely, in many respects, sort of naive to the subject and open to just discovering whatever, and another that does have that sense of more deductive, we think this might be a line of inquiry. So I guess that's a good lesson for all projects in general. Now into the project itself, into the design. So I'm going to go through this in sort of sections of obvious content, like headers and subsets. So the header, full of themselves. How did you arrive at the title?
Yeah, so that was a very much last minute thing. So I did some internally. I always call this the title drop project, of course. But then I needed some catchy title, and I thought "Full of Themselves" was smart and funny. Since all of those title drops in that movie, but yeah. Anyway, later, so the project went semi-viral on Reddit, and people were discussing it, and people were suggesting that it should have been called Roll Credits, and I totally agree. That's a much better title. So basically, title drop, Roll Credits.
Yeah,
that's just fantastic. But
yeah,
I'm still okay with my slightly haha title.
Yeah, I like it, and it feels very apt for one of the examples you picked out. The what is this? Some sort of Suicide Squad? I think it kind of works for that particular example. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now a very small detail, and this might be you, Alice. The squiggle. The first yellow squiggle and the squiggle device used as a separator. And people might think, why the hell is he talking about a squiggle? But nothing happens by chance. And I know that in your work, absolutely nothing happens by chance. It's always thought through. So what's the squiggle?
Yeah, so the squiggle, I think what gave birth to the squiggle was that we really wanted to focus on the findings of Dominicus's analysis in this piece. And so there was a lot, like the point of all of the, at least the static visualizations within the text was to, show some point that we found in the data. So there was always some interpretation that we wanted the viewer to take away from each graph. And you can do that with a caption, or you can just describe that in the text around the visualization. But I just know that when I look at something like this, I usually just look at the visuals and don't read the text in between. Shame on me. But that's why I wanted to make the key messages part of the visualizations. So, but I wanted to distinguish it visually from the data, like the clean data underneath it. So that's why I use the squiggly font to add the interpretations, add some side notes, and also the arrows pointing. So everything that's in the squiggly font is in this font and style because it's added by us as the people who did the analysis.
Yeah, like a different texture. It absolutely works, and it almost feels to me when I first saw it, almost like when you first you sort of pick up a pen and you test it on a piece of paper. Okay, I'm good, and now I'm going to sort of write all my comments. So no,
exactly.
I like it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the idea, and that's how kind of also this just stylized squiggle as part of the main title and also in between the sections just worked with it and kind of just gave a little highlight to the most important headlines.
Basically tells the audience, no, there isn't anything on your screen there. It's part of the website.
I really like to mark up stuff, when I read, and that's kind of added here. Always as explainers and notes.
No, it's a really charming solution. And then we get into the kind of sort of short passage, which obviously acts helpfully, in a sense, for the kind of the header to be very clear to people what you're about to experience, what's about to be covered. And then you get straight into an annotated example. You mentioned before it's Back to the Future, and in this case we've got a couple of clips to back up the two moments when Back to the Future is mentioned. And we've got this absolutely glorious fisheye interaction. Can you just talk us through the choice there for this interactive device to sort of zoom into wherever your cursor is in such a cool and fluid way? I adore it.
I'm glad you like it. Yeah, that's actually why I decided to join the project. It was like we were talking about it and at breakfast, kind of over a cup of coffee, and I was like looking at Dominicus had already done all of these like little timeline visualizations of each movie where you can see a line for each title drop, and I was looking at it and got kind of frustrated with the fact that when you look at a very dense movie where there's a lot of title drops like Barbie, they really bunch together. And usually when you do an interaction for something like that, you would just always highlight the closest title drop with your mouse, and sometimes it just felt like really finicky to do that. It really only highlighted one and you could never get the right one, and so that I thought this is actually an interesting kind of problem, and came up with this idea of why don't we zoom in on this part. And it was also really working with the metaphor of this movie strip. So at first it was just, as I said, like a timeline, but then I thought, they always have these little holes at the side, like the movie strips, where you have the film roll catch on to the strip, and we can use that as tick marks. So it's actually like not only ornamental, it's also the tick mark, but it also is the metaphor. And I'm like, wow, this is cool. And so we really want to do that now. Let me quickly do like a quick how it would look, and then I got really super excited. So yes, the fish eye, and then Dominicus just did it like super quickly. It was cool. So I was like, this would be super cool. And of course there's examples for it. So it's not like we're not the people coming up with fish eye lenses. It just really worked with this idea of, I almost have it like the film folding upwards, so you can see it more closely. And the having those little dots for the holes of the film roll makes it clear how big the time frame you're zooming in on now is. So you keep the context. And it allowed us to highlight multiple movies or title drops at a time. So it was not this, you have to catch this exact one, but instead it always highlights a time frame and shows all of the drops within that time frame. So it's a little bit less finicky, and it just kind of worked really well. So it was, fun.
You see, if you have multiple title drops in a 30-second range or so, like hi Barbie, hi Barbie, hi Barbie, then that all of those title drops show up in the tooltip, and I think that works really well. I think when Alice suggested to have a fisheye, I reacted with a sigh and said, we should have a fisheye. And then I got into the math the rest of the morning and actually figured it out. And I'm really happy that I did, because it looks really cool.
It makes
and it's fun to play around with.
You kind of just want to move your mouse back and forth all the time, because it's just so fluid and nice to play with. So that just makes it more fun.
Absolutely. No, it really works so well. And as you said, it's so coherent with the subject matter. And as you said, it feels like that. When you see editors sort of picking up a reel and getting closer to it, and it's exactly. Fantastic. Actually, it just reminds me of a question. Were there any movies that really pushed you into a dark place when they're like 4 hours long? I'm trying to think about the horizontal space that you're having to think about here.
Yeah, so I think actually having this fisheye that fixed a lot of those problems. But of course, I'm not sure if you noticed that, but if we're showing multiple movies on top of each other, then or above each other, then the horizontal scale gets adjusted by the longest one.
Right. So
if you have some 4-hour monster, some Ben-Hur or Lord of the Rings type, and then you only have short, like 90-minute movies, then they get bunched down a bit. I think we actually left that in because it would still let people compare the lengths of the movies, which is an additional benefit. It's not really what we're talking about in this project, but it's still
But the
nice
distance
to have.
between the title drops is then also the same scale, and
Yeah.
but it's not carried throughout the entire piece. So if there's only one highlighted, then it's scaled to full width. So
Yeah.
we don't end up like some movies just being always very, very tiny and not taking up enough space because there's just
Yes.
this one 7-hour movie somewhere in the data set and you don't even see it. So it's just for longer lists that it's scaled in a way so that the length means something.
Yeah. No, that's a
Yeah.
that's a very smart, sensible solution to bring into that. The other thing that just again we kind of focus on the top bit. We'll move on very shortly. The choice, as you said, of Back to the Future, and we get the two clips, and I can understand your previously expressed desire to to have more clips to perhaps back up the context as well of the delivery in each case. But then we get into this kind of opening introduction of a title drop. You've got a few captions from some sample ones. Those are a bit subtle. Those are a bit less subtle. Those that are intentional. Those that are less intentional. And then again a sort of summary of the overarching pattern of the data in this area chart. Now, a broader question, I guess, here is there's a lot of writing that you have to do. And did you at any point sort of step away and think there's too much, there's too little? How did you even find a tone of voice? Because it's perfectly judged in my view as a sort of light-hearted, almost like a fan who's written it. But how did you sort of find the writing task of the write-up on this project?
Yeah, I actually I've written a lot around the analysis, as you noticed, and I'm happy that I actually found the right tone, since I think you're part of my target audience, Andy. So at least that worked out.
Yeah.
The thing is, I wanted to provide people with a context of the data because it's such a rich topic, and I wanted to keep people on board for the whole time instead of them just quitting the piece after 2 paragraphs because I had the wrong or I did the wrong definition of a title drop or something like that. So that's why I talk a lot about my approach. And as for the tone, I try to keep it fun, lighthearted, entertaining even. And I'm not sure if I succeeded with that, but mainly because there's a lot of numbers in there and there's a lot of analysis, and it's actually pretty tough topic. So I try to keep at least the tone as lighthearted as possible. Do some stupid jokes in between.
No, I think you absolutely achieved that, and I think it's perfectly fitting for the content and for the, as you said, for the type of person who's reading this as well. So yeah, we've gone through the header, we've had the introduction, the kind of outline of the data, and then we're into the stats, and we've picked up on a few already. And again, I think there's just a few features to point out here. First of all, there's a nice toggle that you have to separate fiction from fiction documentaries. What was the sort of thinking there that led you to want to have that separation?
So the original approach was, of course, to look at all movies equally. But then one thing I noticed relatively quickly was that if you just look at all movies, then it's usually the documentaries winning out when it comes to title drops, which is, well, if you think about it, it's kind of obvious. So the overall winner when it comes to title drops was Mickey, the Story of a Mouse, which is about the Disney Corporation. And it's a documentary, and of course they're mentioning Mickey constantly throughout this movie. So you have 309 title drops. And all of my top 10 lists that I created based on the data were filled with those relatively obscure documentaries. Sorry to all of the documentary makers out there, but I hadn't heard of them, and I wanted to see movies that I've heard of already. So at some point I decided to introduce this toggle and also later in the analysis, we're talking about the relationship between genre and the number of title drops. And of course, it's also in there that documentaries just have a lot of title drops,
Yeah,
as you would
absolutely.
expect.
Yeah, and I think it's a brilliant treatment because you're saying that they're both, they're almost two sides of the same coin, but we want you to have a choice of which side you are looking at.
Mhm.
And I wonder actually, obviously you've talked there about the sort of top 10 rhythm that we're now starting to get into in the project. Was that remotely inspired by the sort of BuzzFeedy type stuff, or was it just it's an obvious thing to do, top 10s, it's just a natural way of thinking about lists?
I guess
Maybe.
if you're a data person, you always want to know the most,
The most, yeah.
the biggest number,
The
who
fewest,
wins.
the least. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
So yeah, no, it was also inspired by the listicles, of course, because
Yeah.
I was curious if there would be some overlap between
Yeah.
those top 10 best title drops from BuzzFeed and the data-driven lists that I've created. There's not a lot of overlap, of course, but yeah.
And across the page we've got various moments of sort of summary analysis. We've talked before about the area chart summarizing all the data patterns. Lower down the page we get to a couple of nice pie charts in respect to the protagonists and the names in titles. There's also a moment here where you have this kind of collapsible note to the reader, a little side note, and this feels like one of those where you really felt necessary to say, right, hang on, we need to say a few things about this. So like a little sidebar or a little note to the audience. What made you feel that was particularly important at this juncture?
Yeah, so this aside is about a choice that we made where each movie that is named after its protagonist has a little icon of a person, which I've found to be a nice touch. And it also helped us with the analysis because we could actually separate those movies that were named after protagonists and those that were not. The only downside was that I could clearly see certain movies where the analysis said it's not named after the protagonist, where I was 100% certain that it actually was, just because the data that I based it on from IMDb was not complete. So it was like 5 actors that were part of a certain production. And of course, if the name of the protagonist would only show up on the 6th position, then I couldn't really identify it.
Right.
So basically those 3,500 movies or so where I clearly say this is named after the protagonist, I'm pretty certain that that's correct. But in the rest, in the other 71,000 movies that are still left, then there's definitely some that are named after the protagonist, and I just couldn't identify that. And as for putting it here as a collapsible aside, at that point, I felt that I had already written so much about the data analysis that I wanted to make it optional for the reader if they want to dive into another rabbit hole together with me.
Yeah, because I guess we're now at this point, we're in the sort of flow of the findings, and it would feel a bit of a departure if it was in the body text, I guess. Yeah, that would make sense. Now, low down the page, one of my favourite contents, the title drops over the years. We've got this summary chart, and I'm reluctant to call it a dot plot, but it kind of is. It's also kind of a range, diverging bar chart. I absolutely love the style of it, and there's so little details to it. In fact, I've got a whole page dedicated to this in my upcoming book in November.
Cool.
But the little details. So yeah, to describe it for those who are listening rather than watching, we've kind of got decades across the bottom. We've got the percentages down the side, and this is the title drops for all movies, but then we get some sort of sense of variation decade by decade, where it's dropped below or dropped above. When it's below, the sort of the difference is a grey bar. We've got this fade to make sure that you don't see the axis as to recognise it's a non-zero axis. Apologies. And then we've got different colours. I mean, I've said a few things there, but can you just talk me through the styling, the design iteration of this? How much care and attention you clearly went through on this one?
Yeah, so I think we started out, maybe I can say a little thing about all of the charts. So all of the charts come out of a Panda notebook that Dominicus did the analysis in Python and kind of just created them there. And it's possible to export them as SVGs from there. And then all of the graphics were then styled in Figma. So I had kind of the height of the bars and everything came out of the data analysis. And then basically all of the styling just happened in Figma. And so I started out with a bar chart on this one. But then I was kind of like, well, the most important thing here is also to show the average. And then I thought it was most clear to show to see the pattern by showing the difference to the average. And that's why I chose to highlight that part in the bar chart, although that's not technically part of the bar anymore. So, so that was, I think, the thinking behind that. And then also to be able to zoom in on the most important pattern, it was better to truncate the axis, as you said. And so I wanted to make it really clear that it's not it's not standing on the 0 axis. So that's where this fading comes in, and the top of the each bar is highlighted in this bright shining neon yellow, which I think is why you called it a dot plot, because it highlights kind of the point where the top of the bars are. And actually it's funny because I proposed a very similar idea to a client after this project, and they didn't like it. So they were like, this is way too complicated. It didn't make it into the final publication. So I'm glad this has a fan. I also like it. But apparently it's a little complicated maybe, but I think it really, I wanted in each chart to emphasize really the main message and not just have something that shows the data, but really also with the squiggles and all of the annotations to really draw attention to what are you supposed to take away from this chart. And I thought this was also the most fun for me in this project, because all of the charts were there, or there were some charts there, and sometimes I was like, but this would be much more obvious in this other way. And then Dominicus generated the chart for me in Panda, basically the basic shape chart. And that part I love about data visualization, to just think about like not only how to show the data, but how to show the findings and really communicate, pick the perfect chart. I mean, I don't know if I always pick the perfect chart, but like at least strive to take like the most the best pattern showing chart.
And also in this case, it's also the kind of almost inverting things. So by highlighting what's not happened, by highlighting the gap between the actual and the average. So it because of the color scheme, it gives you that scope to do a little bit of almost like the sort of visual illusion of the foreground background. So or the figure ground, that's the phrase I'm looking for, which I think works terrifically well. So I love that chart. And well, I do hope the alternative that the client picked for their chart type was super, because they've missed out big there. So we'll see.
They picked a bar chart.
And that's why we do passion projects, to fully release ourselves. Yeah, exactly.
To go nuts.
Exactly. Now, I'm very aware of time, folks, and so there is lots more we could go through. But I'm just wondering, from a design point of view, are there any other little details that you'd just love to share with people, or anything that you think we would have liked to have done this, especially, but we didn't have the scope at the time, the place, or the confidence in the data? Any other little business that you want to share?
I think from my end, one of the unusual parts of this project was that for just time constraints reason, we went to just show static charts, and they're basically exported SVGs, as I have touched on. And kind of this brought about some other challenges that, for example, we couldn't do really wide charts because there is no way to scale them but keep the font sizes large enough to be able to read them. So it did play a role in how these charts look, and why, for example, there is another instance of this type of difference chart that we just talked about, which is flipped. It's just because in that particular case, they had long titles on the x-axis, so it wasn't possible to make all of them fit, but still being able to shrink it down on mobile so that it doesn't get tiny. And I thought that was like an interesting challenge, because usually in most of our other projects, the visualizations are actually coded, and it's possible to work with fluid font scales, for example, to be able to have or to maybe even hide some details on mobile views. So it's a little bit of a different way of thinking about responsive design when you're working with only static charts. Yeah, that's maybe a quick point.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the data side, so something that I always like to have at the end of such a project is to have an explorer of the full data sets. So in this case, we focused on the single movies, so you can, as we mentioned, you can type in the name of the movie and then you get this little film strip that tells you where title drops are happening. And you can also do that for multiple movies, but usually I also like to have a kind of a super dense explorer tool that lets you look at all of the movies and filter and sort and do all other kinds of data nerd stuff. But so we didn't really get around to building something like that. But the data is available online, so if people want to do that for themselves, then they're free to do it.
Now, I guess the big question then is this going to be a one-off? Are you going to keep feeding it with more and more content? Is it going to be something that you kind of keep tendering to, or have you moved on from title drops and you need to have some closure?
So I did two little side experiments. So I used the subtitles to make a special cut of Jumanji and one of Oppenheimer that only has the scenes where a person says Jumanji or where a person says Oppenheimer. And that's very fun initially and then very tedious to watch if you just watch 12 minutes of people saying Oppenheimer, Dr. Oppenheimer.
It was really fun. I loved that.
I think it's somewhere up on YouTube, so you can look it up.
Right,
but,
okay.
Yeah, so that's one thing that you could do with the data. For now, I think this analysis at least has run its course, I think, but the data set is super rich, and I wonder if we'll return to it at some point. Could happen.
So. Yeah, maybe get some grant people out there to fund some extra, as you said, some deeper humanities explorations that could turn out to academic papers and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, that's been wonderful. I mean, as I've said, I knew this could be a 3-hour episode, but we have to bring it to an end at some point. Dominicus, Alice, thank you so much for going through the details of that wonderful project. Thank you to everyone out there for watching and listening, and we'll see you again soon on another episode of Explore, Explain. Bye for now. Thank you. To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing, and spreading the word. See you next time.